Luke chapter 16. That's where we're going to be in just a few moments. St. Peter's and St. Mary's Church in Steward, England, had a problem. They, and as many of you know, in England, churches are fairly weak. The culture's certainly changed a lot more than it's changed here. And they needed repairs done, and they didn't know how they were going to get the repairs done on their building. And so Reverend Michael Eden had an unusual plan. Pretty risky plan. He decided to take the money that they had and to give it to the people and ask the people to multiply the money. What he did is he took 10 pounds, that's about $18 in U.S. money, and he distributed that to each and every person of the congregation. The congregation did different things with the money. One person took it and bought baking ingredients and made $750 selling cakes and scones. Another bought wool and earned $138 selling scarves. In the end, the church raised more than $9,200. Fairly risky plan, you might say, but a fairly effective plan. Michael Eden commented, "God gives us all sorts of things, but does not expect any of us to waste them and do nothing." This morning you see the word on the screen, steward. And some of you are probably thinking, oh boy, we're talking about money today, right? It's even green, right? But stewardship is far more than just dollars. It's a worldview. It's a way of seeing reality. It's an understanding that says all that we have is God's and how we use it is important. As Michael Eden commented, we have really already been given 10 pounds, right? We've already been given all of the resources that God has given to us. How many of you think that the people in St. Peter and St. Mary's Church went out and bought video games or bought lattes with that 10 pounds? Anybody? No, you wouldn't do that, right? Why wouldn't you do that? Because you understand that money is sacred money, right? And people, I think, probably thought a little bit different about how they spent that money than they do their paychecks. But in reality, it's all the same thing, isn't it? In reality, we're just as accountable with what God has given us as we are with the money that the church would give us in this particular case. The people felt a responsibility to use the money wisely. And this illustration, I think, gives us an example of reality, how things really are. In our sermon today, we're going to talk about a story that Jesus told, a parable. And before we dive into this, let's spend a few minutes and talk about where we've been the last couple of weeks. As many of you know, we are in the 4th week of a 5-week series talking about our mission statement. Let me have you click the slide there, two spots there, and one more, and one more. These guys are sleeping up there, right? I'm just joking. This is our mission statement. We are a Spirit-led people gathered to care for and empower each other by stewarding God's resources to impact our community for Christ. You probably see this on the front of your bulletin if you take a bulletin, right, every week. And you may even see the headings in the bulletin with those 5 words: gather, care, empower, steward, and impact. And that's what we're talking about this morning. Just to review just a bit, we talked about a few weeks ago what it means to gather, right? We gather physically to unite ourselves in heart and mind, right? And we remind each other of what God has been doing and what God is going to do. We care for one another. As we studied 1 John, we learned that Christ's love is made complete in us as we love one another, as we care for each other. Last week, we talked about empowering one another. What does it mean to empower each other? Well, we do this by studying Scripture together, by praying for one another, by sharing our stories with one another, by sharing life together. It's both a horizontal thing. We empower each other, and ultimately, our power is a vertical thing. It comes from God. And this Sunday, this morning, we come to the 4th one, which is steward. It's really about how we allocate our resources, the resources that we've been given. And as our mission statement says, God's resources, right? Not just our resources are God's resources. You might also know that the way in which our church is made up in terms of polity, in terms of government. We have a leadership team, or leadership church coordination team is what we call that team. And all 5 areas are covered on that team. Worship is gathering, right? We care, member care. We empower, and that's really 3 areas. Children, youth, and adult is all about that. And then we steward. We say property is the stewardship one. And then we impact. We say outreach is that. And it's easy, I think, sometimes to kind of compartmentalize those things, right? And say, well, okay, I serve on the children's team, so I'm all about empowering, right? Or I serve on the property team, so my job is stewardship. But we've learned, haven't we, over time, that those lines are not quite as rigid as we maybe thought, right? And we've also learned in this series that we are all responsible together, right? We're all responsible to care for one another. We're not exempt from that just because we're not on the care committee, right? We still have to care for each other. We all empower one another. Everybody's involved in that. We all steward. Everything that God has given us and the church's resources are all God's resources. And so it's not just for the property team. And outreach is not just for the outreach team or the outreach group that's doing this or that. Outreach is something that we all do. And our impact, as we're going to learn next week, is not just in programs that we do, but our impact is in everything that we do. In our offices, in our schools, we are impacting our community. So we understand that our mission statement is this all-encompassing thing, and we are all involved in all areas of that. So here we go. Let's talk about stewarding this morning. When it comes to this whole idea of money, our resources, Jesus has a lot to say about this. But when Jesus taught on the subject, he often told stories. Really, stories are really the best way, aren't they, to make a point stick? Because, you probably don't remember a lot of what I say on Sunday mornings, but the stories I tell, that's probably what you remember, right? In fact, most of the comments I have after the service have to do with the stories I told, right? Because people remember stories. Stories stick with us. And so that's how Jesus illustrated spiritual truths to us. He told parables. And parables are earthly stories with a heavenly meaning, or worldly stories with a spiritual meaning. So this morning we're going to be looking at a parable in Luke chapter 16. And by the way, do you realize that Jesus told over 20 parables that had to do with wealth and resources? Jesus talked a lot about this thing we call stewardship. And in this text this morning, Bob Hartley is going to come. I'm going to invite Bob to come on up. And as you have your Bibles open to Luke chapter 16, Bob and I were emailing this week, and Bob emailed me and said, wait a minute, I don't understand this story. And I said, just wait till Sunday, Bob. You'll learn more about it there. But the story that Bob's going to read for us is a fairly shocking story. But it teaches us what it means to steward God's resources. So go ahead, Bob. Let's read Luke chapter 16, verses 1 through 13.
The parable of the... Is that all?
Marcina did first services. She's a little bit shorter than you. So just pull it all the way up. There you go.
Luke 16, 1 through 13, the parable of the shrewd manager. Jesus told his disciples there was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and asked him, "What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be manager any longer." The manager said to himself, "What shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do so that when I lose my job, there will be welcome in, when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their homes." So he called in each one of the master's debtors. He asked the first, "How much do you owe my master?" 900 gallons of olive oil, he replied. The manager told him, "Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 450. Then he asked the second, "How much do you owe?" 1,000 bushels of wheat, he replied. He told him, "Take your bill and make it 800. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly, for the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so when it is gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings." Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much, and whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So if you've not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money.
All right, thanks, Bob. All right, you read this story, right? We've got this guy who loses his job, and we don't know exactly why other than just some form of mismanagement. The text says he is accused of wasting his possessions. The man then is fired. Can't imagine what he's going to do. He says, I'm not strong enough to dig. I'm ashamed to beg. He says, I have an idea. I know what I'll do. When I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses. He calls the people in who owe his master money, and he reduces their debt. Now, this parable is one of the most baffling parables in the Bible. And when I read this parable, I don't know about you, but I was left scratching my head. Let's think about this guy for a minute. Here's this guy who's been left in charge of all his master's property. So we're going to call this guy the manager, okay? And this was not uncommon in this day and time for a landlord or a master to leave a manager in charge of all of his resources. And he would travel maybe to distant lands. He would maybe go and buy and sell and trade and do whatever he would do. And the manager would have full responsibility over all of the master's resources. He would have his checkbook, okay? He would have his authority. Today's terms, he'd have his credit card, okay? He'd have everything that the master owned was in the possession and was able to be used by the manager. The manager was responsible. Now, the stuff was not the manager's stuff. It still belonged to the master. But the manager was responsible. And then the manager, in this case, is being called into account. We see this a number of times in Scripture, don't you? You may remember several stories where someone is waiting for the master to return. Jesus likes to use this. And here, the master is going to return, and when he does, he finds something wrong. The manager has been misusing or mishandling or wasting. We're not exactly sure, but the master, I keep getting that mixed up, so you have to excuse me, master and manager, right? But the master comes in, he tells the manager, look, you're fired. Clean your desk out. In fact, I'm going to run an errand. When I come back, you better be gone, okay? Because you have been not doing your job, not utilizing the resources you've been given, and your job is over. The manager thinks, what am I going to do? I got kids going to college next year. I've got to put food on the table. I have bills to pay. What's going to happen? If you've ever lost a job, you've probably had that same sort of a mindset. What am I going to do? A million ideas are running through this guy's head, and then the text says, I know what I'll do. The Greek actually reads, suddenly I know what I'll do, okay? So this guy has an idea, and he figures, I got a few more minutes with the credit card in hand, okay? A few more minutes with the authority of the master, and so I'm going to go, and I'm going to reduce the debts of those people who owe him money, okay? And then, when I don't have a job, those people will be on my side, and I'll have earned friends, and I'll be in good shape. So he goes to those people. And the language here is so quick. He says, how much do you owe? He didn't even know how much these people owe, okay? If it was in today's times, right, he'd probably have it on his cell phone. He'd be able to pull up the account really fast and look at it. But it's almost as if he doesn't have time to go look up the amounts. He goes quickly to the first guy, and he says, how much do you owe? One translation says 800 gallons. Yours may say 900 gallons of olive oil. You and I are looking at that today, and we go, okay, 900 gallons of olive oil. How much is that worth, okay? I mean, if you go to Aldi and buy olive oil, you start a gallon. How much would that be? Well, here's the deal, and scholars have helped us out here to translate this in terms of our dollars. Most have said that this amount of olive oil would have been somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000 denarii, okay? And a denarii is a day's wage. So start doing the math on that. That's about 3 years of wages. That's a lot of money, isn't it? A lot of money. And he calls the guy in and he says, how much do you owe? The guy says, about 3 years worth of my wages. And he says, well, I'm going to break that down to a year and a half. 50% discount, he says. Wow, man, that's nice. Okay, thanks. Next guy, he goes to him and says, how much do you owe my master? The guy says, 1,000 bushels of wheat. 1,000 bushels of wheat. You and I are going, well, how much is that worth, right? Well, scholars tell us that this is worth about 2,500 denarii. Okay, so a lot more money that this guy owes here. And he cuts it down to 800 bushels. Now, if you do the math and you look at this, you might say, well, he gave the one guy a 50% discount, and he didn't give this guy as much of a discount. But if you look at it, the amount that he cuts off is equal to a year and a half's wages. So he gives the guy the same discount, even though it's a different percentage. So this guy now takes off a year and a half worth of work for what he owes. Again, pretty significant amount of money, don't you think? But here's the kicker. Jesus tells this story, and we're thinking, right, this guy is a crook. I mean, the master did the right thing in firing this manager, don't you think? I mean, here he is. He's a sneaky guy. And he's moving around. He's going to these people, and he's forgiving their money. And you might even say, he still had the authority to do that at that point in time. But at the same time, he knew he was getting fired, so he really didn't have the authority to do it, right? And he goes and he does it. And we're reading the story, and we're thinking, right, Jesus is going to let this guy have it, isn't he? Jesus is going to talk about dishonesty and morality, and he's going to let this guy have it. But look at what verse 8 says. The master commended the dishonest manager because he what? Acted shrewdly. And you and I are going, whoa, wait a minute. Sometimes Jesus uses questionable characters, doesn't he, to make a point? And there's some theories on this. Some people have said, this guy was probably charging extraordinary interest, way more than he should have. And all the manager was doing was pulling the debt down to a reasonable amount, okay? But let's don't go there, because Jesus says this guy is what? Dishonest. So Jesus isn't commending the guy's behavior at all. Jesus is saying this guy is dishonest. This guy is doing what he should not do. But notice he's commended. He's commended not for his dishonesty. He's commended for his shrewdness. Now let's talk about what it means to be shrewd. To be shrewd is to be wise. To be shrewd is to think ahead, okay? To be shrewd is to prepare now for what is going to come. And that's why this guy is commended. The master, it's almost as if the master says, look here, you're getting all smart on me now, right? You were mismanaging my money. I was firing you, but now you're actually doing what I wanted you to do in the beginning, right? I wanted you to think about the future, and I wanted you to prepare for the future. Now, as we read this here, we might remember Jesus in Matthew chapter 10 saying this, I am sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore, be as shrewd as snakes and innocent as doves. Jesus tells us to be shrewd. And here he's instructing his disciples here before he sends them out to be shrewd. Shrewd is about understanding that time is limited. Shrewd is about understanding that the master's credit card is not going to work in 2 weeks, but it works right now, you see. That's what it means to be shrewd. Jesus' point here is that we should have this same urgency, this same mindset when it comes to things of the kingdom. Let's keep reading together in verse 8 here. Jesus shifts the focus from the dishonest manager to the disciples, and he speaks to them. He says this, for the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. There are two words for world in the Greek. One is cosmos. Okay, that means like for God so loved the world. But there's another one called anios, and it has to do with the age. And that's what Jesus is using here. The people of this age, okay, in contrast to the people of the light. So we've got this age that we're living in, and then there is another age that is coming. It's the kingdom of God. It's a different age. People are going to think differently, act differently. God is going to be ruling that kingdom in a different way than he rules now, and in the sense that the evil one is going to lose his power. There is an age that is coming, and then there is this age. And Jesus says, look, the people of this age, the people of this world, they're dishonest, right? They're not moral, right? But they're shrewd. And there's something that we can learn from them. And that's what Jesus is saying here. They have one up on you guys. Think about this for a minute, how this would translate into our world today. Jesus might say to us, look, the people of this world, the people of this age, they think about education. They plan out education. They think deeply about it. Are you, as the people of God, thinking about educating your kids in the ways of God in the same sort of deliberate sort of fashion? Think about that for a minute. The people of this world, the media agencies of the world, they're thinking about the culture that we live in. They're thinking about how to relate to culture, how to get messages across to the culture. And as the church, too often, we don't pay any attention to our culture, do we? We just do things the same way that we've always been doing them, and we don't think about it. Jesus says you need to be shrewd, you need to be wise, you need to think about the way in which the world thinks. Sometimes the people of this world are better at handling their finances than churches are, right? Sometimes the people of this world are intentional about it. How are we going to take the resources that we've been given and use them to make money for our company, right? And we at the church just say, whatever we have, let's just do it like we've always been doing it, right? But Jesus says you need to be more deliberate. You need to be shrewd. You need to be wise. You need to be thinking about the age that is to come and use what you have now to plan for then. You see, you are to be a shrewd people. And Jesus says, quite frankly, they're doing a better job at it than you are. That's what he tells us. Jesus challenges his followers in this parable. He calls us to be wise. He calls us to think ahead. He calls us to realize that our time is limited. The same dynamic in this parable is true in reality. The master is away, right? But one day he's going to call us into account. That's what it's like in the kingdom. Jesus is calling his followers to have a greater sense of urgency, a greater sense of realizing what have we been given and how are we going to use it to further this kingdom. Let's keep reading here in verse 9. Jesus says, I tell you, use worldly wealth. And the word worldly there is sometimes even translated as unrighteous. Think about that for a minute. Use unrighteous wealth or worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves so that when it is gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Now, don't misread this. Jesus isn't telling us to use our money to make friends, okay? He's not talking about winning a popularity contest with our money. But he's using this illustration of this parable. This guy is taking the resources that he's been given and he's making friends for himself, okay? In other words, he is preparing for the age that is to come, for the reality that is to come. He's taking what he has now and he's spending it so that in eternity he'll be welcomed in, or in his thinking in terms of the parable, so that after the job is over, he'll be welcomed in by these people. Jesus is telling us to use the unrighteous or the worldly wealth that we have to prepare for ourselves things in the future. You see, there's understanding, this dynamic, that what we have now and how we use what we have now, we're going to one day be held accountable for that. We are to use the resources that we've been given for eternal purposes, things that will outlast this world. Think about that for a minute. The things of this world will one day be gone, right? But there's a way to invest today with what will last. Remember, Jesus said, store up for yourselves treasures not on earth where moth and rust destroy, but in heaven, where moth and rust do not destroy, where thieves do not break in and steal. You see, there's a way to do that. We are to take the resources that we've been given, and we're not just talking about money here. We're talking about our time, our energy, all that God has given us, and we are invested in the age that is to come. We need to live in a way, Jesus is telling us, that plans for the age that is to come. To live in this reality, that we're responsible for whatever it is we've been given, and what we do now with it will matter later. That's what Jesus is saying. As Jesus continues to teach about living in the kingdom, the servant in this parable was not faithful. He did not manage his master's resources well. In fact, he was fired for being a bad manager. But he was shrewd, and when he was shrewd, he actually is commended for that. He's praised because he finally gets it. And look what Jesus says in verse 10. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. Whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. And then he keeps on saying, so, if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you've not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? Do you see the contrast here between worldly wealth and then true riches? We've got worldly wealth. How many of you have worldly wealth? Some of you are going, I don't know about that. We've had to use the word wealth. But yes, you have been given wealth, right? I mean, you have a place to live. You probably are going to eat at least lunch or dinner today, right? You aren't starving. You aren't without shelter. You have worldly wealth. All of us do. And we could really get into this, but if we really took the world as a whole and we began to think about our incomes based on the entire world, most of us would be in the top 1 or 2% of the whole world. You see, we have been given much. But Jesus says, the master, if he gives us worldly wealth and we use it right and we invest it into the kingdom, he will give us true riches. And if the worldly wealth that we have we don't use as we should, then who's going to give us more? That's what he says here. Now, embedded in this teaching is another truth. The other truth is that the wealth that we have, the resources that we have, again, not just money, but time and energy, everything that we've been given, gifts and talents, they are all given to us by God. You see, that's embedded in this teaching. And I don't think that many of us get this. Some of you might say, well, you know what? The stuff I have, I've worked really hard for. Everybody else is laying in bed, and I got up early, and I worked hard, and I've saved my money. I haven't spent it on everything else. And the resources that I have, that's because I've earned them, you might say. And I would say back to you, how did you earn them? Well, I worked. Well, who gave you the ability to work? God did. We could follow this logic on whatever, right? Who gave you the talent to do whatever you do? God did. Ultimately, all that we have is God's. Everything that we have is God's, and that's embedded in the teaching. Our money is not really ours, all of it. Our time is not really ours. Our abilities are not really ours. They are on loan from God. And we are challenged this morning to invest them in something that will outlast us. So what do we do with this story this morning? What does it mean for us as a church and as people of God? I think there are at least 3 applications this morning I want to talk about. The first one is this. I think that this story teaches us that we are called to be shrewd. And that's not a word we use a lot today, but it's an important word. And it's really a deep and involved word. How are we shrewd? I think we are to pay attention, right? We are to think about what's going on around us. Most of us are just walking around in this stupor sometimes, aren't we? Just oblivious to everything that's going on, and we just let it all work out, you know. And I think we got to kind of turn our frame of mind to one that says, what does God want us to do? How is He calling me to live today? Maybe you would say at your workplace. I wonder how many of you walk into work on Monday morning and take just 5 seconds to say a prayer, something like, God, what do you want me to do today? What conversations do you want me to have? How do you want me to respond to people? God, would you use this workday that you've given me for your glory? God, please do that. I just challenge you to do that every day before you walk into your office. Maybe as you leave your office or leave your school and you go home and be with your family, if you just say the prayer, God, what do you want me to do in my family today? How do I respond to my family? How can I be wise? How can I invest whatever it is you've given me into something that's going to outlast me? You see, we are called to be a shrewd people. And all that we have, we got to think about the future. Living in this urgency, again, the image of a credit card that's going to get swiped and not work anymore, okay? One day, they're going to swipe and they're going to say, decline. You can't invest anymore. One day, your heart's going to stop beating. One day, you're not going to wake up for a new day. One day, what you've been given here will be gone. How have you invested it in eternity? Secondly, I think another application is that we need to understand that the stuff we have, we are simply managers. We are not the master, okay? We do not own what we have. It is not ours. Think about that for a minute. Everything that we have. You know, the principle of the tithe. Since I was a little bitty kid, I was taught you give back to God a little bit of what you've been given. And even if I got $1 from my granddaddy, my mom said, you put the dime in the offering plate. And I learned how to do that. And you know, it's a way, it's a practice. You have $1, you give a dime. You have $5, you give 50 cents. And you know, sometimes we get hung up on the percentage, and some people say, well, I have to do 10%. But that's what Scripture teaches. And why does it teach that? It teaches that because it's a principle, isn't it? It's a principle that says, all of this is God's, but I'm gonna act in this way. I'm going to place this dime or this 50 cents or 10% of whatever I've been given into an offering plate just to say, God, it's not mine. And it reminds me of that every time I do that. And you know, it's easy with $1 or $5, isn't it? It's really hard to do with a whole paycheck, right? It's not easy, but when we do it, we're acting and we're confessing and we're saying, God, none of this is mine. I'm just giving you back a little bit just to remind myself that it's not mine. That's what it means to tithe. We understand that we are managers. Finally, I think the last thing that we learn from this parable is that we live as stewards. Allow me to challenge you to think about that for a minute. That the whole idea of stewardship. We are managers, and what we have, we are to utilize those things, our time, our resources, our money, not for our own benefit, but for the benefit of the kingdom. Let's go back to that story at the very first of the sermon. The people of the church that needed repairs. Again, they were given an envelope, and it had 10 pounds in it. That was sacred money. They took it and they utilized it so that their building could be repaired. They were paying attention. They were using it. They were stewarding those resources. What do you have today? What has God given you? Is it time? Is it energy? Is it a specific talent? Is it financial gain? What is it? And how are you using that so that you are making friends for the future, in the words of this parable? We're going to take a few minutes this morning. I'd like to give you an opportunity to respond as the band comes before we come to the table this morning. We're going to sing a song, and as we sing this song, if there's a decision you'd like to make this morning, if you'd like to join this church, if you'd like to come forward for baptism, if you'd like to simply come and kneel at the altar this morning and pray, you do that. And then as we are finished with this song, we're going to move into communion together. So let's all stand together.